Hey all, Will here with the latest development update video for Manifold Garden. The last 2 weeks have been pretty slow. We've been dealing with bug fixes and writing tools to help us deal with these bugs. For a long time we had a bug where the audio in the build didn't match what was in the editor. This was really confusing, especially because the entire team works remotely. The sound designer would make a change and he'd hear one thing in the editor, but then someone else would try the build and hear something completely different. We could never quite pinpoint what was going on. It seemed like it happened randomly as well, so it was very difficult to reproduce it until recently. The problem turned out to be related to our build process. You see, Unity can be run using command line arguments. This lets you automate the process of making builds. Instead of manually opening up Unity, making a build, naming it, zipping the file, and uploading it, we've automated all of this with a custom C# program. All it takes now is a single command, and it actually handles multiple platforms as well. We run this on a dedicated machine so that we can continue working on the game, since only one instance of Unity can be run at a time. So back to the audio problem. As I said, sometimes the build just wouldn't have the latest audio changes. And recently we had some music and common sounds updated, and sure enough, the changes weren't in the build, so we finally got to investigating. We tried to recreate the exact same steps on multiple machines, and we noticed that builds that were manually made had the latest sounds, whereas sometimes the builds that were made automatically using the pipeline, sometimes they had different sounds. And this was actually one pattern that we noticed was if you made a build manually and then used the automated build pipeline, the audio was fine. So it turns out opening the project in Unity is what was causing this. You see, FMOD actually has two separate places where it stores banks. These are the collections of FMOD files used in builds of the game. So one place is in the FMOD project folder, and the other is the streaming assets folder. And when you open the Unity editor with the FMOD plugin, then FMOD checks if the banks from the FMOD project folder are different, and if they are, copies them to the streaming assets folder. Unity then detects that the streaming assets bank has changed and re-imports them. However, when we use the automated build pipeline, it actually runs Unity in batch mode. So the Unity editor is never opened. We just grab the latest changes from Perforce and run the automated build tool. Since the editor is never opened, the custom plugin logic isn't run, which means that FMOD doesn't copy the files from the FMOD project folder to the streaming assets folder. And so any changes made to the FMOD project banks aren't included in the build. Once we figured out what was going on, the fix was pretty simple. Basically, in our automated build process script, we added these 3 lines. The first line initializes things in the FMOD plugin, checking which banks have changed and which ones haven't. Second line simply tells FMOD to copy the banks from the FMOD project folder to the streaming assets folder. Finally, the last line just tells Unity to check for any change files and re-import them if necessary. We've also been dealing with a really bizarre bug that's been leading to a hard crash on the console version. It's been really difficult to solve, again, because it seems to happen randomly. To help track down this bug, we've set up automated soak tests. What this does is it goes through the list of scenes in the game automatically, places the player in each one, lets the neighbor levels finish loading, then moves the player to the next one. We can enable or disable various features in the game for the test, such as shadows, post-processing effects, gameplay objects, and so on. So we just ran this test over and over again on multiple machines. Eventually, we started to notice some patterns in the data. It became clear that when this culling option was enabled, the game would crash within 10 seconds to 15 minutes. And when it was disabled, the game would run for at least 4, 5, 6 hours. So it didn't tell us what was the bug, but it definitely gave us a very clear direction of where to look. And now Garret is going to talk a bit about improvements to the Footstep system.
Hey, this is Garret from the Manifold Garden team, and I wanted to talk about the Footstep sound system that we've got in Manifold Garden and the recent changes and improvements we just made to it. So the old Footstep sound system, the system that decides when to play a footstep sound, we had 2 sounds that we use, basically a walking sound that's soft and a running sound that's kind of hard. And the system we used, that was just kind of a placeholder to decide when to play a sound, was based on time, the amount of time that the player has spent moving, walking or running. It wasn't based on anything more sophisticated than that. So if you were on walking at full speed, it would sound like this. And if you're running at full speed, it would sound like this. Which is fine. But if you're not running at full speed or walking at full speed, it's still based on time, so you would get a sound like this. So that's not really what we want. So I've improved the sound system, and now it sounds like this. So the new sound system is based on velocity and distance. Let me move that cursor out of the way. There we go. Based on velocity and distance, so you get a much more natural sound to it. So here's the sound walking slowly. And here's the sound running. So it's a much more natural transition between the walking and running sound, and it's much more natural. It's more like feet. So one of the things I noticed was that when you're running, your feet are landing faster even though you're covering more distance. So I didn't want to do it just strictly based on distance. It's also distance and velocity compared to each other. And so there's a minimum and maximum distance, and that's lerped between your velocity, your minimum maximum velocity. So at slow speeds, the distance covered before I play a sound is relatively small and much larger when you're running. And these values, if you're a Unity user, these values are stored in a scriptable object, so we can actually edit them at runtime in the editor. It's really handy. So that's the first change to the system, is the distance and velocity. The second is to actually take into account player rotation. So now if you turn your head, it's a pretty soft walking sound, but every 90 degrees I'll play a walking step, just to simulate a person turning their head and moving their feet. So that's the second change. The third change is taking into account sudden stops. So if you are running really fast and you come to a stop, I'll play a running sound. If you're walking, I'll play a walking sound. So you get sounds, and it's pretty subtle. It's pretty subtle, but let's see if you can hear it. Here's the run. You want it again? Basically, you get an extra footstep sound at the end, even if you haven't covered the distance required to play that sound. Same thing goes for walking. So now the sound system is much more natural. Also takes into account velocity coming up and down stairs. Much more natural sounding system. Thanks for watching.
All right, that's it for this time. If you want to stay up to date, we have a mailing list you can sign up for. You can also subscribe to this YouTube channel. I'm on Twitter. We have a Discord. I also stream development almost daily. Don't forget, you can wishlist the game on Steam. All the links can be found in the video description below. Thank you for the support, and I'll see you around.